Fifth, the Islamic view portrays Jesus as a failure. The Jesus of the Quran spent years preaching Islam only to have his life's work sabotaged by Allah, who can...
Hey guys, welcome back to the channel. Today I've stumbled across this video where David Wood, a Christian apologist and philosopher, is going head-to-head with Dr. Khalil Andani, a Muslim scholar from Harvard, debating whether the Quran actually denies the crucifixion of Jesus. And what David reveals about the traditional Islamic interpretation is absolutely mind-blowing, because he's going to show you how it portrays Jesus as a complete failure whose entire ministry accomplished nothing, and how it makes Allah look like the greatest deceiver in history who even tricks his own followers. So make sure you watch until the end, and please comment down below where you're watching from. I really love to see people from all over the world connecting in here. All right, now let's get into the video.
You hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you, Cameron, for hosting, and thank you, Khalil, for that opening presentation. Cam, you called this a debate, but I think it's going to be more like 2 hours of me enthusiastically nodding in agreement with Khalil, because I agree with a lot of what he said in his opening there, and I'll point out in agreement that it has been difficult for me over the years to read Surah 4 verse 157 of the Quran without seeing it through the specific lens of substitution theory, the theory that Allah disguised someone else and made him look like Jesus, because that's just what I always heard long before I even was reading the Quran. But after many discussions and debates on this topic, I can now say I'm no longer convinced that the Quran denies the crucifixion and death of Jesus. I'm definitely not convinced that the Quran supports the idea that Judas or someone else was crucified in Jesus' place. And if it was difficult for me, an outsider and a critic, to read what the Quran says without being massively influenced by later commentators, I can only imagine how difficult it must be for Muslims to read this verse without assuming that it promotes the view they've heard all their lives from their sheikhs, imams, da'is, apologists, families and friends. But I have a question here at the beginning for all of the Muslims who are watching. You believe that the Quran is the speech of Allah. You believe that Surah 4 verse 157 is the speech of Allah. And so the question is, if Allah isn't saying what you think he's saying, if most Muslim scholars have misunderstood this verse for a variety of reasons, if you've been given a false interpretation of Allah's words, do you want to know it? In other words, if you're wrong about what 4:157 means, would you want to know it, or would you rather continue believing an incorrect interpretation of what Allah said about Jesus? If you're open to the idea that there may be some better ways of understanding what the Quran says about the crucifixion, I invite you to carefully consider Khalil's opening remarks, and I'll just add a few additional thoughts. In case you're new to this topic, Jesus' death by crucifixion is considered a fact of history by historical Jesus scholars and New Testament scholars, regardless of their theological background. The scholarly consensus on Jesus' death arises from one, having a variety of ancient sources reporting that Jesus was crucified, and two, knowing how crucifixion works. We have Christian, Jewish, and Roman sources reporting Jesus' execution, and our understanding of Roman crucifixion practices pretty well rules out any speculations about Jesus surviving his execution.
This is what genuine intellectual honesty looks like. David Wood just said something that most apologists would never say. He admitted that after years of reading the Quran and debating Muslims, he is no longer convinced the Quran actually denies the crucifixion. Let that sink in for a second. This is a Christian apologist who has built his entire ministry on critiquing Islam, and he just said he agrees with the Muslim scholar sitting across from him. That takes courage. But here is where it gets fascinating. David is asking every Muslim watching a question that cuts straight to the heart of faith. He is asking if Allah is not saying what you think He is saying, if the interpretation you have been taught your entire life is wrong. Would you want to know? Because this is not just about one verse. This is about whether you are willing to let go of tradition when the evidence points somewhere else. And notice what David does next. He does not just throw out his opinion. He brings in the scholars, the academic consensus, the historians who have spent their entire careers studying this. He is talking about atheist scholars, Jewish scholars, people who have zero religious motivation to defend Christianity. And they all agree that Jesus died by crucifixion. This is not Christian propaganda. This is historical fact. When David talks about historical Jesus scholars, regardless of their theological background, all agreeing on the crucifixion, he is making a point that Muslims need to grapple with. You can reject Christian theology all you want. You can say Jesus was not divine. You can say he was just a prophet, but you cannot reject the crucifixion without rejecting the entire field of historical scholarship. That is the position you put yourself in when you hold to the traditional substitution theory. And this is what separates good apologetics from bad apologetics. David is not trying to win by yelling louder. He is building a case brick by brick. First, he establishes that even the Qur'an might not deny the crucifixion. Then he shows that history overwhelmingly confirms it happened. Now he is about to show why the traditional Islamic interpretation creates massive theological problems. This is how you change minds, not by attacking people, but by systematically showing them that the position they hold does not make sense when you actually examine it closely.
Today, we tend to think of crucifixion as just nailing someone to a cross, but Roman crucifixion was a three-step process. The first step was the scourging, which was sometimes called the half death because victims would be half dead by the time just the beating was finished. The Romans used a flagrum made of leather thongs with chunks of bone or metal woven into the strands, which was designed to remove human flesh. We have records of people being beaten until their veins and arteries were exposed, or until their bones were showing, or until their intestines spilled out. And that was just the first step. Step two was nailing the victim to a cross and letting him hang there while the blood drained out of him. Once he stopped gasping for breath, the Romans knew their work was done. Almost. There was still the matter of what to do with the body. Generally, the Romans would leave a corpse on the cross and let it rot and be torn apart and eaten by wild birds and jackals. But if they needed to pry someone off a cross, they would stab him through the heart with a sword or a spear, some sort of death blow, just to make sure the person was dead. Not the sort of process anyone's going to walk away from. So Jesus' death isn't simply a point of Christian doctrine. This isn't just, the Jesus of faith type situation. It's a fact of history, as even non-Christian scholars are happy to admit. A couple of examples. Atheist New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann declares that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. John Dominic Crossan of the infamous Jesus Seminar says that there is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Marcus Borg, another member of the Jesus Seminar, states that Jesus' execution is the most certain fact about the historical Jesus. Jewish scholar Pinchas Lapid concludes that Jesus' death by crucifixion is, quote, historically certain. According to Paula Fredrickson, a convert to Judaism, the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. And Bart Ehrman maintains one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Notice that these non-Christian scholars and writers aren't simply saying that we have some evidence that Jesus died by crucifixion. They're saying it's indisputable, that it's historically certain, that it's one of the most certain facts of history. So I'll call the view that Jesus actually died by crucifixion realism. Call that realism. What people saw happen and what scholars are convinced happened really happened. It wasn't a trick or an illusion. There have always been some Muslim realists with regard to the crucifixion, Muslims who believe that Jesus did die by crucifixion, but realism has always been a minority position in Islam. There are two non-realist theories that are far more popular among Muslims. There's the substitution theory, that Allah replaced Jesus with another person, and what I'll call theistic swoon theory, the theory that Allah miraculously kept Jesus alive throughout the agony of the crucifixion process. This latter theory, theistic swoon theory, is especially associated with Ahmadi Muslims, although non-Ahmadis such as Ahmed Deedat, Zakir Naik, and Shabir Ali have all defended it. Khalil pointed that out. Shabir Ali seems to believe this theory. I don't think Ahmed Deedat actually believed it. I don't think Zakir Naik actually believes it. I suspect they defended it because they knew that substitution theory sounds absolutely ridiculous to non-Muslims. So maybe they thought that the swoon theory would be a better option for defending in debate. So what's wrong with substitution theory? A bunch of things. First, the Quran says nothing about Allah taking another person and disguising him to make him look like Jesus. This, as Khalil pointed out, comes from later commentaries. None of these commentaries goes back to Muhammad, and they contradict each other on almost every detail. Second, there's only one verse in the Quran that can even be interpreted as promoting the substitution myth, and the verse is open to a number of alternative explanations by simply comparing it with other Quran verses, as Khalil showed. Third, we know where substitution theory originated. It originated among the Gnostics and Docetists, two groups that had nothing whatsoever in common with Islam. These groups are further removed from Islam than Christianity is. So if the author of the Quran was taking this theory from the Docetists, that is a major problem for the Quran. But if later commentators got this idea somehow, or were influenced by the Docetists, that's a problem for the commentators, not for the Quran. Fourth, substitution theory portrays Allah as a malicious deceiver. If Jesus didn't actually die, but Allah made people think that Jesus died, the real reason billions of people are now convinced that Jesus died is that Allah did an outstanding job tricking everyone. I mean, if the substitution theory is correct, the reason that Khalil now believes there was a crucifixion, and that I believe there was a crucifixion, and that Cameron believes that there's a crucifixion, is because Allah just did such a great job tricking everyone that we're still tricked by this. We know that Jesus' followers became convinced that he died as well. We know that Jesus' followers went out preaching his death by crucifixion. According to the substitution myth, where did they get that idea? They got it from Allah, because Allah is the one who tricked people into believing that.
David just explained what Roman crucifixion actually involved, and he did it for a very specific reason. Because when you understand what this process actually was, the idea that someone could survive it, or that it was somehow faked, becomes extremely difficult to defend. The Romans had a systematic approach that historians have documented extensively. This was not something people walked away from. And then David brings in the scholars again, an atheist New Testament scholar saying the crucifixion is indisputable. Let me repeat that. An atheist scholar who has no reason to defend Christian claims is saying this is indisputable historical fact. When you have atheists, Jews, Christians, and secular historians all agreeing on something, that level of consensus across worldviews tells you something important. But now we get to the real challenge with substitution theory. And this is where David raises questions that are genuinely hard to answer. He points out that if substitution theory is correct, if Allah disguised someone else to look like Jesus, then the reason everyone believes in the crucifixion today, including Muslims like Khalil who accept it happened, is because this was such an effective intervention. Think about what that means. The Romans believed it, the Jewish authorities believed it, the disciples who were there believed it. 2,000 years of historians believed it. Even Muslims believed it for over a millennium until modern scholarship started questioning it. But here is the deeper issue David is raising. According to Islamic theology, Jesus' disciples were Muslims. They were believers. They followed the Prophet. And yet they went out preaching that Jesus died and rose again. According to substitution theory, they were mistaken about what happened. They spread a message for 2,000 years that was not accurate. How does that fit with the idea that Allah protects his prophets and their missions? This is why David keeps focusing on this point, because once you understand the implications, substitution theory creates complications that are hard to resolve. You are not just talking about protecting Jesus, you are talking about a situation where even the people who loved and followed the Prophet ended up with a fundamentally different understanding of what occurred. That raises real questions about how divine protection actually works in this framework.
But according to the Quran, Jesus' followers were devout Muslims. So if these devout Muslim followers of Jesus were deceived, we can conclude that Allah deceives even the people who follow his prophets. And if that's acceptable, then wow. Fifth, the Islamic view portrays Jesus as a failure. The Jesus of the Quran spent years preaching Islam only to have his life's work sabotaged by Allah, who convinced the world that Jesus died by crucifixion, ultimately giving rise to Christianity. According to the Quran, again, they were devout Muslims, but they must have disappeared rather quickly without so much as a whimper, because we have no records of Jesus' followers who didn't believe in his crucifixion. So the Islamic Jesus didn't win a single lasting convert, and he accomplished absolutely nothing of any lasting significance if we stick to substitution theory. I'll just quote, in the words of Sheikh Imran Hussein, substitution theory is pathetic nonsense. That's not me, that's from a Muslim. So what's the alternative? Well, there are several realist interpretations of 4:157. If you read 4:157 completely on its own, it does sound like it's denying the reality of Jesus' crucifixion and death. If you read it in context, you realize that the verse isn't critiquing Christian beliefs about Jesus. As Khalil pointed out, it's critiquing various misdeeds of a group of Jews. 4:157 is correcting their boast that they had killed the Messiah. Even without this surrounding context, it still sounds, even with this surrounding context, it still sounds like it's denying Jesus' crucifixion and death. But when you read 4:157 in context, along with certain other Quran verses in the extended literary context, I agree with Khalil, you do start to get a different picture. If you were to read 355, 5117, and 1933 without thinking of substitution theory, you'd get the impression that the Quran acknowledges Jesus' death. And if you read 3:145, 3:169, 8:17, 39:42, verses like this, and then you go to 4:157, you start to get the impression that the Quran is only claiming that even though Jesus was killed by crucifixion, he wasn't really killed by these Jewish boasters, either because it was all part of Allah's plan or because you simply can't kill someone like Jesus since his soul lives on. So if you read 4:157 without the greater context, substitution theory fits pretty well. But if you interpret the Quran with the Quran, Khalil's position starts to look stronger and stronger. So 4:157 allows multiple interpretations, but if I were a Muslim, I'd go with the interpretation that doesn't portray Allah as a horrible deceiver who leads people into error for no apparent reason.
Here is where David makes his most challenging point. He says, if these devout Muslim followers of Jesus were mistaken about what happened, that raises questions about how we understand divine guidance. Think about what that means. If the people who dedicated their lives to following a prophet could be so fundamentally wrong about the central event of his ministry, that creates uncertainty. How do we know what we can trust? How do we know our understanding of other prophetic messages is accurate? Because if even righteous people who followed the messenger closely could be mistaken, that affects how we think about religious certainty in general. And then David raises something that honestly made me pause when I first heard it. He says, the traditional Islamic view ends up portraying Jesus in a way that seems inconsistent with his importance. Jesus spent years preaching according to the Quran, and what happened? His message got overshadowed by Christianity. The original followers left no lasting historical community. Every single person who claims to follow Jesus today either accepts the Christian narrative or they are Muslims who arrived 600 years later with a completely different account. Where are the communities that continued his original teaching? They disappeared from history. That is a real puzzle when you think about it. Islam teaches that Jesus was one of the greatest prophets, but if substitution theory is accurate, his ministry did not produce any lasting results in the way other prophets did. Moses left the Israelites. Muhammad left the Muslim community, but Jesus left no identifiable community that maintained his original message. His teachings were replaced. His followers were mistaken, and this happened as part of the divine plan. How does that align with the idea of prophetic success? And notice, David even references a Muslim scholar. Sheikh Imran Hussein calls substitution theory problematic. This is not just Christians critiquing Islam. This is Muslims recognizing that this traditional interpretation creates challenges that deserve serious examination. But listen to how David ends this. He says, if you read the verse without context, substitution theory seems to fit. But if you interpret the Quran with the Quran, if you look at all the other verses about martyrdom and divine will, then Khalil's position that Jesus actually was crucified starts to make more sense. And then David says, if I were a Muslim, I would choose the interpretation that does not create these theological complications when there are other valid ways to read the text. That right there is the entire argument. David is saying you have options in how you read this verse. You can choose the interpretation that creates all these difficult questions about divine guidance and prophetic success, or you can choose the interpretation that aligns with historical consensus and still works within an Islamic framework. The Quran allows for that flexibility. So why choose the interpretation that generates so many complications when you have alternatives? So what do you guys think of this? Leave your thoughts down in the comments. Please like and subscribe, and I will see you in the next video.